Welcome back to the Cruise Elite podcast. Tony's here on the other end. Tony, how are you?
What's going on, man?
Not much, dude.
I was thinking about you the other day because you know how on Instagram when you put up a story, you can put music to it?
Yeah.
And I love music, and it always kind of, to me, it just like adds so much to the content, whatever it is. It could just be like a block of text, but if there's music, suddenly there's an emotion to it. And anyways, I realized that like a lot of times I'm like going back to like throwback 90s hip hop stuff.
Yeah.
And I was like, Taylor mentioned the other day that he loves hip hop. So I was just going to ask you about that. Like,
oh my gosh.
Did you grow up listening to hip hop?
Like in high school. It's weird, man, because I never have considered myself like a music guy necessarily. Like I've never had one style of music or really any style of music that I was always wanting to listen to. But in high school, for whatever reason, it was, you know, all that classic, I call it classic anyway, all that classic hip hop, man. And so when I hear that stuff randomly, it just like brings back all the memories and stuff, listening to that and being, you know, a high school athlete. And that was playing, you know, that kind of stuff was playing in the locker room and playing while I was doing my bench press and my bicep curls, you know?
Yeah. That's the montage, you know?
Yeah. And skateboarding, right? We talked about that briefly.
Yep.
Because growing up,
like
I
was
punk
or hip hop, right?
Yep.
That was
yeah. And actually for me with skateboarding, it was very diverse because I remember as a skateboarder listening to all the classic rock stuff too. And, you know, Pink Floyd and Jethro Tull and The Who and all that stuff would come in there too. So like one day it was Wu-Tang Clan and then all of a sudden it was Jethro Tull playing a flute. Oh man, so fun. And I was such an avid skateboarder. Oh my gosh. I could get back into skateboarding like today. That's how much I love it. Yeah.
Okay.
And I've been threatening to do that because my daughter has a scooter and she's been cruising around hard on her scooter for the last year and a half. And she's seen my skateboard in the shed, which hasn't been used in a long, long time. And every time we see it, she's like, "Are we going skateboarding this summer?" And I'm like, yeah, we're going to head up to the skate park and bring your scooter. And if that happens, like, it's game on.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. That's like a hardcore sport to bond with your daughter on.
Yeah, seriously. And I could actually see her being pretty good at it. So we'll see where it takes us.
Dude, that's so cool. Are you gonna have her wear like wrist guards and elbow pads and knee pads and stuff?
I mean,
because I imagine you didn't back then.
No, back then, man, it was gnarly. I mean, you know what we used for padding? We just wore pants. Like literally, that was it. You're just like, all right, if I wear jeans or I wear like thick cargo pants, even on a hot day when you want to be wearing shorts, you know, you're putting on jeans, and that way, if you fall and you know you skin yourself, you put a hole in your jeans, but it's not that bad on your skin.
Yeah,
that's about it, man. We'll see. I don't know. That'll be funny. She's got the wrist guard. I mean, wrist guards might be good early on, but a helmet, you know.
Yeah. Well, you'll keep us posted.
Yeah.
Awesome, man. So what are we talking about today?
All right. Well, I'm gonna hand it over to you to explain to the listeners because I love your idea. Tony, he put together a really, really creative idea on how we could talk about some different things through kind of a neurologic lens. So Tony, want to explain that one?
Yeah. So, you know, one of the things that struck me about this brain-based approach, right, is that you could run a lot of different movements or interventions or stimulus through it and do an assessment, right? Like that's one of the first things we talk about is like, this is how you can assess something and see how your brain is responding to it.
Yep.
And, you know, you've been in the fitness industry for a while. And so you've done a lot of stuff prior to, you know, focusing more on this neuroscience based approach. And so I thought it would be super interesting to think about the times where other modalities, either knowingly or unknowingly, have utilized kind of a brain-based approach or use things that we now understand through this approach
Mm-hmm.
are doing more than maybe just the proprioceptive
Right.
action of, bending the knee or doing this or
Right.
um, so
Yep.
I feel like it was more eloquent when I spoke to you on the phone the other day, but that's the gist of it. Like, where can we find the neuroscience and other modalities,
Yeah, I like
and
it.
how do we assess those other modalities from a brain-based perspective?
Nice, nice. I like it. Really, really clever idea. A lot of my thinking goes into this because I spend a lot of time looking at what other people are doing or looking at other fitness philosophies, styles of movement, and kind of running them through a neurologic filter so that I can better understand what is this thing doing for the person? What is it activating? What can it offer us? And then I also kind of look at it from the stance of what is it missing? Why is it potentially incomplete? Or in some cases, maybe why is this thing, this activity, or this way of fitness maybe not necessarily what this individual needs right now? And could it actually be what they don't need at the moment? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spend a lot of time looking at not only different philosophies on movement, but also literally like single exercises too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
always running things through the filter, trying to understand it better from a neurologic perspective. And it's fun, right? It's really fun for me to approach it that way. And the thing that I love most about the study of neuroscience and the use of applied neurology is that when you kind of look at anything through this filter, through this brain based filter, it removes the argument that always bothered me from the beginning in the fitness industry about which method is better. Because now you can kind of look at anything and go, oh, now I understand why this person said that worked really well for them.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe the next person said it didn't work for them.
Mm-hmm.
Because as a trainer, and I know if we have movement professionals listening to the podcast, and I'm sure that they can relate to this, but it's like there's always a constant argument going on. It's like, no, this is better than that. Those exercises aren't any good. These ones are the way to go. This
Mm-hmm.
methodology is not a good one, whatever the case might be. And that gets really exhausting after a while as a movement professional. And it also, I think, leads to kind of like a lot of anxiety for trainers early on in their career when they're sifting through all these different philosophies, trying to gain a skill set that they know will help them help other people. And now you're constantly, feeling attacked because you might be learning something and then someone else says it's no good. And so I love to run things through the filter because it removes that argument and I no longer have to be a part of it
Yeah.
because I can start to understand, hey, I know why this might work for someone. I know why this might not. So I was thinking about all these different things that we could highlight and we could approach it in so many different ways. And I do have some things on my mind. Like I want to talk about yoga today and I want to talk about bodybuilding and potentially some other more like therapeutic interventions like massage therapy, maybe acupuncture. We're just going to kind of free flow it, see how it unfolds. And I think that would be really neat because as I was thinking about different movement practices that we could highlight, I realized they could go into the weeds really quickly and we could literally run one thing through a filter and like really dissect it. I didn't want to necessarily do that. So I started kind of listing different things. And off the top of my head, in thinking about that movement practice or that therapeutic intervention, I asked myself, what stands out the most? What does this offer us? What is it? What does it seem like it's activating in terms of our brain and our nervous system the most? And I kind of started there. And then that sort of led me to thinking about what it can do for us and then maybe where it's also limited.
Mm-hmm.
So, shall we?
Let's dive in.
Okay. So, let's start with yoga. I think there's actually a lot to say about yoga in this regard. Have you ever done yoga, Tony?
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
have? Cool.
a handful of times, but there
Yeah.
was a studio at my old apartment, like not at, but around the corner from my old apartment.
Nice.
And I would probably go once a month for a little while. And I never remembered, the poses or whatever,
Yeah.
but I enjoyed it a lot. I think for what I was doing at the time, which was mostly kind of like powerlifting type
Yeah.
stuff, it felt like a good, what's the word I'm
Like
looking for?
kind
Compliment
of,
to that.
yes. Yeah. Giving you kind of variety that wasn't
Mhm.
there with with the powerlifting. Yeah. I'm pretty limited in terms of the yoga I've done. I think I took like 6 classes. This was years ago. I had a friend who was like, "Hey, you got to come try this out." And I have like a free pass to the facility she was going to take the classes. And I ended up doing like 6 Bikram yoga classes. That's where you like
That's the
you're in the
hot
hot.
yoga
Yeah,
one?
yes, the
Yeah.
hot one. Yeah. I noticed a couple things right away. I noticed because I had this kind of idea of what yoga was in my mind just from observing what other people are doing and seeing things online and stuff, and talking to a lot of yoga practitioners because I've actually had a lot of clients who were yoga practitioners, and so I've had a lot of conversations about what they consider yoga and what they were kind of working into their practice. And one of the things that I learned about yoga very quickly is that not all yoga is the same. There's
Yeah.
so many different kinds of yoga, and that's for better or for worse. I think it goes both ways
Mhm.
because what you have going on right now is what's happening to like all of the different practices that are common in the fitness industry as like group fitness practices. You have a lot of variety now because instructors are now getting educated on so many different kinds of things. They're bringing it into their practice. So what one person calls yoga now, somebody else might not. And that makes it a little bit difficult. So like as we talk about this, for folks out there who are listening, like I'm going to be generalizing for sure at kind of like what
Mhm.
my just basic understanding and idea of yoga is, and we're going to kind of look at it that way. I think that's important just because it seems like there's just such a variety. So when I think about yoga, and I think when the average person thinks about yoga, they think about, being in a group fitness class, there's an instructor at the front of the room, you're following a flow
Mhm.
of different poses and different movements, all kind of flexibility based. Sometimes there's balance involved because you're doing things that require you to be in a narrow stance or a staggered stance or even standing on one leg.
Mhm.
And yeah, you're just kind of working through different poses that require a good amount of flexibility and some mobility. And I think actually, let's start right there because there's a difference between the two.
Mhm.
And it's important for people to understand that difference because now things are getting very blended, right? Mobility and flexibility are finally popular topics. Even just 10 years ago, people really weren't getting into it. 20 years ago, it was non existent. And now mobility is a buzzword. And I think it's kind of getting grouped together with flexibility. They're somewhat different, although personally, now as a coach, as I talk about them, I don't even necessarily care about people separating, the terminology, because when we say mobility or flexibility, what we're really meaning is, being able to express range of motion, right, with our
Mhm.
body, being able to bend, being able to, reach these different positions with our body that we want. So, just real quick, so people can understand, generally speaking, flexibility is thought of as more of a passive range of motion that we can get into. So imagine like somebody getting into a split, right? And relaxing into that position more. Maybe you have gravity helping you achieve that. Maybe you have an external force helping you
Mhm.
achieve that. Sometimes with like flexibility moves or poses, right? You might have another person helping you achieve a deeper position.
Mhm.
Maybe you're stretching your body in a way and you're leveraging it against something that is immovable, like the wall or a squat rack. And that type of movement or stretch is thought of as somewhat more passive. And that is generally what we kind of are thinking about when we think about flexibility. And mobility is going to be different in the sense that it's the active range of motion that we can take our joints and muscles through where we're actually controlling it. So there's more motor control involved. So, for example, if you were to put your arm against the wall and do like a classical pec stretch where
Mm-hmm.
your hand is against the doorway or something and you're leaning into it and you're feeling that stretch sensation on your pec, you're using gravity and you're using an immovable object as you leverage your body into the stretch. It's those forces that are helping you achieve the range of motion. And that's going to be different than if I just move my arm behind me actively, where now I'm
Mm-hmm.
requiring my muscles to contract in order to bring the joint to its end range of motion. That's what we think about more as mobility
Mm-hmm.
because of the motor control aspect of it. You have to own the whole range of motion with your coordination versus the other example where you're just leaning into it and you're using leverage to get there. Now, it's important to understand those two things because what we're ultimately trying to do with a good mobility and flexibility practice is in the process of improving our range of motion. What we're trying to do is reduce what's called the active passive gap. And that is the gap between what is your passive range of motion, where you're using some other force to help you achieve a position, versus your active ability to achieve that position. You will have a gap to some degree between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And that gap we want to be as small as possible. The bigger that gap is between what is passive and what is active flexibility and mobility, the higher the risk factor is for getting injured within that range of motion. And that's because any range of motion that we can achieve through momentum is
Mm-hmm.
potentially now a dangerous range of motion because we don't have motor control over that movement. So that's a very important distinction.
So, an example that I'm thinking of is, let's say you're on like a soccer field and you get knocked over or you slide or something, and passively your leg gets put out in some crazy position. When
Right.
your muscles contract to control it in that position, that's when bad things can happen if you're not able to actually own it at that extreme range.
Yes. So if momentum is helping you achieve the range of motion, so you have a lot of different forces happening in that example. And
Mm-hmm.
if your leg is kind of sliding out to the side or something on the soccer field, and you are now entering what is your passive range of motion or the gap, we should say,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have control over it, you don't end up owning the control to potentially stop yourself from going further. And so, yes, you will end up contracting, right? Your muscles will contract to try to protect you. But
Mm-hmm.
if you don't own good motor control at those end ranges of motion and also strength, then your risk factor is going to go up for injury. And that's why it's so important to train. If you're going to be trying to work on your flexibility, which is great, you also want to make sure that your mobility practice has a very strong active component to it so that you can work on end range motor control, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And that distinction is important to make as we go into the yoga conversation, because a lot of forms of yoga tend to be a bit more passive in nature, where the goal is more to like relax and kind of go deeper into a particular pose. But on the other hand, like a lot of it is active too, but it's not always active in the way that I think is most valuable. That's an important thing to understand when we're thinking about basic yoga. Now, kind of thinking about what does yoga give us? Well, obviously, there's a lot of proprioception that comes from a yoga practice. And
Mm-hmm.
remember from our last episode talking about proprioception, Proprioception is your sense for understanding where your body is. So understanding where your limbs are in their
Mm-hmm.
precise position, understanding where your trunk is, where your head is. And yoga will help you with proprioception, right? Because you're working through all these different stances and kind of lunge templates and working on different poses and really having to stabilize yourself in some of them because they're rather challenging. And the cool thing actually about that is that with yoga, you're barefoot. And I really
Mm-hmm.
like that about it because
Yeah.
as you're working on proprioception, you're actually doing that, with your feet and being able to feel the ground and make all those little micro adjustments that need to happen as you're working through these different flows. I think that's really a cool benefit. So proprioception's a big one.
And to put in other words, you are running through a lot of different positions that you might not encounter in your day-to-day life,
Hmm.
whether it's passive or active, and that would that be expanding your movement box?
Yes, it would. Nice. I like it. So you're expanding options, right? And getting people to explore different lunge templates and different ways to move their body and handle their body weight, right? In different positions under different loads is fantastic for expanding the movement box and gaining more options. I will say that one of the things that is kind of missing from a yoga practice. And I'm not actually even thinking that it's a bad thing because I think that as we get into some of the deeper neurology about yoga here in a moment, I think that yoga is very, very activating for very specific parts of our neurology. And I truly believe it's by design,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting because it's such an old practice.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll talk about that. So, as I was saying, we've got the proprioception that's going to be, there's going to be a lot of proprioceptive training in yoga. There, interestingly enough, as I was thinking about this, because I'm looking at this through what I call the sensory triad. So, this is something that I educate about. It kind of helps us understand the different aspects of our sensory system. But we have proprioception as one of them. We have what's called exteroception, which is another one, which is the type of senses that we have for understanding our external environment, like our eyes, like our visual system,
Mm-hmm.
or like maybe our ears, right? Those things help us understand the external environment. One of the best ways to train better exteroception is with vision training. Now, interestingly enough, some yoga practices actually exercise the eyes,
Hmm.
which is incredibly unique because almost nothing out there utilizes vision training. It's very rare. I don't know that yoga goes too far into it. I really don't think that it goes super far, but there are basic vision exercises that I've heard from other yoga practitioners that they do some basic convergence and divergence work where you're following, a target
Mm-hmm.
in and following it out. And they do different kinds of gaze stabilization exercises where you're basically just holding your eyes on a specific target in a specific position. So it's kind of interesting that they worked that in to some
Mm-hmm.
of these yoga practices. So that's another part of that sensory triad. And the other one that I feel like I have the most to talk about when it comes to yoga is what's called interoception. So we've got this triad of exteroception, interoception, and proprioception. We know proprioception is our sense for understanding where our limbs are. We know that exteroception is our sense for understanding the external environment through some of our major senses, like our eyes, our ears, feeling things with our skin,
Mm-hmm.
smell, those types of things. Interoception is super unique because it is our sense for understanding our internal body and also our sense for understanding ourself. And it happens to be incredibly intertwined with kind of our level of emotional grounding. And we'll kind of talk about this
Mm-hmm.
stuff. But your interoception is the sense that allows us to understand what does it mean when you're hungry? What does it mean when you're thirsty? Like, what are those feelings? And do you know what they are? Other examples would be, for example, you walk into a restaurant and you get into that kind of stereotypical restaurant environment. The lights are dim, you're there with other people, maybe there's sound in the background, you've got waiters and waitresses, and now you're being delivered food and you happen to be really hungry and you feel your stomach start to growl.
Mm-hmm.
That is an interoceptive kind of activity that's beginning to happen because you're being triggered by the environment and your body's starting to understand, oh, it's time to eat. And then you start getting the stomach growling, right? Or maybe you begin to eat and you kind of have that sensation of, you're starting to produce saliva right in your mouth. That's an interoceptive kind of thing that's happening because your body is preparing itself to ingest and digest food. And you don't think about this, but we have a sense for all this stuff. And you have to understand what those things mean. And right now, as a parent of a 3-year-old, I'm thinking about this a lot because my daughter is now saying things like, my belly is telling me it's hungry. And so we're trying to really teach her about interoception at this age so that she can understand these signals better.
Mm-hmm.
Or my belly is telling me I'm full. Or I smelled that and I don't know if I like that food, right? Things like that. And so we have a sense, this interoceptive sense, that allows us to understand these internal feelings and processes that are happening. And this sense is directly linked to two things that are worth mentioning. Number one is a brain area called the insula. The insula is, part of the cortex, kind of buried deep in the middle of it. And it is the home of interoception. And it is also very much related to the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the wandering nerve, the longest nerve in the body, the one that innervates all of our internal organs. And so these two things are of huge importance when it comes to interoception and understanding what your body's internal feelings are. Your vagus nerve, not only does it innervate your organs, but it's also kind of the anti-inflammatory pathway. There's a lot of cool things that we know about the vagus nerve, and you can activate this interoception, right? You can train this interoception to be better. And you would do that by directly training the insula and the vagus nerve. Guess what? Yoga does that, and it does it extraordinarily well. And it's because of some of the types of exercises and activities that go into it. And so we'll break that down a little bit. Yoga practices often have breathing exercises involved with them. And breathing exercises are a really, really powerful way to directly stimulate the insula and the vagus nerve. And there's different styles of breathing, and we're not going to get into all the different kinds of breathing exercises, but just know that when you're focusing on your breathing, you are training your interoception, no matter what kind of breathing practice it is. And there's a lot of mindfulness training in some yoga practices. I'm not sure what to call it. I'm not an expert at yoga. So do we call it meditation? I'm not sure. I decided to call it mindfulness, but I think people will know what I'm talking about, where you have moments where you might be focusing on your breathing and doing some kind of mindfulness or meditation. Maybe you're focusing on something else. Maybe the goal is to focus on nothing. Whatever the case might be, the act of that is training the insula, which is another. So it's a really great way to train interoception. And another one is just the stretching. So putting yourself into a position, lengthening the muscles, trying to feel a stretch. That is a very interoceptive activity because you're trying to feel your body. You're trying to feel the stretch sensation. And it's interesting because there's a very specific nerve ending called a C fiber that you are stimulating with stretching. So when you bring your muscles into their longest position, you kind of relax into that a little bit, you try to feel a stretch. Maybe you're breathing at the same time. When the muscles are stretched and the connective tissues are stretched, that's activating these C fibers. It's a nerve ending. And that C fiber activation is speaking directly to the vagus nerve and the insula. So again, with yoga practices, you're activating those brain areas once again. And a lot of times they're doing this all at once. You're in a position, you're stretching, you're focusing on what you're feeling. At the same time, you're breathing, and maybe you have some sort of mindfulness, activity going on. Really interesting, very powerful for the insula.
Yeah. So as you're saying it, I mean, it very much feels intentional and by design. Like let's attack this very specific, and attack's probably the wrong word even, but let's focus on this very specific system within our bodies. And maybe they didn't have a name for it as such, but they probably had a different name for it, right?
Yeah.
It begs the question, do we really get a lot of time stimulating the vagus nerve and the insula in other exercise modalities, or is this fairly unique to yoga?
That's a great question. So yes, overall, I think that the average person, the average fitness enthusiast, is lacking in terms of, are we getting enough activation with the insula? Yoga does it exceptionally well. There are other modalities that are also doing it, but they're doing it slightly different. And that actually brings us to bodybuilding, which this is an interesting one because we're about to kind of compare yoga and bodybuilding. And, that's based on two extremes, but in a very interesting neurologic way, they happen to both be wonderful activities for stimulating the insula and the vagus nerve. The way that bodybuilding is doing that is different because it's all about muscle mapping. So your ability to understand your body based on how well you can contract your muscles is an interoceptive skill. As a personal trainer, and I know some of our listeners who are coaches will understand this part. Have you ever had a client and you were like, hey, I just want you to contract your glutes, at this end range of motion, like the goal here is hip extension. We're strengthening your glutes. Can you give some more voluntary contraction in this exercise? And the person's like, I'm trying, but I don't know what you mean, and I can't feel it.
Yep.
Right. It happens to people all the time. The glutes are a common body area where this is happening, but it can happen with any muscle group. And it does. It happens with all sorts of muscle groups. That is a lack of an interoceptive map because you don't have a good map for contracting the muscle yet. Maybe you haven't had that experience. You haven't learned how to do that. Maybe you've had an injury history that has led you to that. Whatever the case might be, our ability to express strength and contract our muscles is an interoceptive skill because it requires a lot of tension, creating tension, and understanding how to manipulate our body with all these little micro adjustments to create that tension and contraction. And it's very interesting because when you look at the neurology again with how we might go to train interoception, it comes back to those C fibers. The nerve ending that we discussed, the contraction of muscles, especially at the end range of motion, activates a lot of C fibers. So whether you're shortening the muscle and contracting, or you're eccentrically loading it by lengthening a muscle under tension, you're activating a lot of C fibers. And so that is clarifying your interoceptive map of your body with your muscles. And bodybuilders do this constantly. In fact, early on in my training, back in high school and even slightly before, as I was just getting into weightlifting, I was basically bodybuilding, right? I was just like, I was going for the pump, all the basic stuff.
Pump.
Yes, that's what I was trying to do. And I liked it, right? There was something it was giving me and I liked it. And I didn't really know necessarily what that was, but if I was doing my curls or, my presses or whatever the case might be, I was basically going to failure. Like in my mind as a 15, 16-year-old boy, it's like, well, I'm going to go to failure with this exercise. I'm going to put everything I have into it. And not only am I going to feel a pump and a burning of the muscle, which, by the way, the fatigue and the burning that you feel when you exhaust a muscle, that also is an interoceptive training tool and
Sure.
activates the insula in the vagus nerve. So that's what I would do. And I would feel the pump, right? And that pump that you feel with blood in the muscle is also very interoceptive because you're getting a lot of sensory feedback from the activity. So here I am, 15, 16-year-old boy. I'm working on my interoceptive map, even though I don't know that. I'm just trying to, make my biceps stronger and make my chest bigger. That was the goal. But it gave me mapping that I think I still have today. It's really interesting. Like I got really good at contracting my muscles hard and feeling what it takes to do that, in how to put that effort into it. And I think that actually has served me, into my adult life, because when I'm learning new exercises and stuff, I can generally figure out how to position my body to feel what I'm trying to feel or how to generate tension in that position. So bodybuilding is a unique one. Now, this is interesting to think about. Bodybuilding carries a lot of negatives with it. I'll first say people seem to be attracted to the activities that they not only need from a neurologic perspective, but also sometimes you are attracted to an activity because you're kind of naturally already good at it. So kind of going back to yoga, we see a lot of bendy people doing a yoga practice because they were bendy to begin with. Right. And that's important to know. So when you see people doing that and, you're having trouble with all the basic poses, like a lot of times people are just doing it because they already were comfortable getting into those positions. Sometimes we get attracted to different forms of weightlifting because we're already kind of naturally strong. And so you get attracted to these things for a couple different reasons. The other reason is sometimes you are in need of the activation that activity can give you. And I really believe that you find those things that you need. So early on, I gravitated towards kind of the bodybuilding / powerlifting approach. And I think that the reason I found that and liked it so much was because I needed a lot more cortical activation. I was the kid in school that, was told you have these learning disabilities. That's what we called it back then. You have to go into the special class where, things are slowed down and you're not going to be exposed to the same material as the smart people. I heard it all growing up and having differences in the way that I learned information. Go figure, my favorite thing in life is learning. But in school, they always told me, "Oh, I'm sorry, you are not able to learn like the rest of them."
Yeah,
And
for what it's worth, as an aside, that's like pretty surprising to hear because you're one of the more educated and well-spoken people that I know. So,
oh, thanks, dude. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Well, school was a nightmare for me and very traumatic, actually, because of how stressful it became. And so I was always like, I believed what I was being told. Right. And so then it kind of became this situation where I was finding ways to avoid school and finding ways to meet the narrative that I was being told. Right. And that's kind of, I think, what happens to some people when you're surrounded by so much. It's like, well, if they're telling me that's what I am, I have to make sure that I meet that standard in order to feel comfortable. Right. Because I don't want to be something I'm not. So I started gravitating towards sports, and that led me, to lacrosse. And I started understanding that if I could make my body stronger, right, then I might have better sport performance. Now I'm learning about, what I can do in the weight room and getting into weight training. And it started giving me something that really helped me in a lot of ways, mentally, emotionally. And that was bodybuilding and powerlifting, lifting heavy weights and feeling the contraction of my muscles, giving myself all that C fiber activation and cortical load, because I say cortical because I'm sort of grouping things together here. Voluntary movement is a very, very strong cortical activation. So, like a bicep curl,
Mm-hmm.
you're like, okay, right bicep, I want you to curl this weight. That's what I mean by voluntary movement. Your plan is to do it voluntarily, and that's a really strong cortical stimulus. And growing up, I had a lot of cortical issues, right? Some, a lot of them were learning, challenges. Things that stand out to me are like executive function and like decision making.
Hmm.
And actually, early on, when I was a youngster, wetting my bed. I was the kid that couldn't go sleep over his friend's house because I might pee in my buddy's bed, right? And it's like, and that was also very traumatic in some ways.
Yeah.
And turns out that that's also a cortical thing, because one of the things your cortex does is it inhibits that impulse, right? It gives you the ability, whether you are sleeping or not, to go, hey, I don't want to pee right now. Like, it allows you to inhibit kind of reflexes.
So this reminds me a lot of deficiencies that you were talking about in other systems. Like if there's a vestibular deficiency or a visual
Yes,
deficiency, that stimulating that system and getting your body to, or your mind to engage in that system more, suddenly is solving these other problems downstream.
exactly. Exactly. And for me, I believe that I was gravitating towards bodybuilding and powerlifting because my brain was in need of that cortical support. And I loved it. And it started to be something that I always wanted to have. However, this is where things get interesting, because what you generally see is when you're gravitating towards an activity that's giving you exactly what you need, you always run the risk of overdosing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened to me. So my relationship with fitness became not a great one, because now I was eventually the person that was lifting too heavy too often, kind of giving myself that stimulus more than I should. Or I guess looking back on it now, things just weren't balanced enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my training was actually, I would call it sophisticated for being like a high schooler.
Mm-hmm.
And I was lucky to have really good coaches and instructors that, taught me early on. But still, if you're doing too much and you're not taking care of your body in the process, there's a consequence to that long term.
So
So,
I,
yeah, go
I
ahead.
often hear like, oh, like I have a CNS hit, or like it really taxes, like too many deadlifts. It really taxes my CNS, which is central nervous system, right?
Mhm.
Is this terminology that you use in your approach, or is this something more like a layman's term and it doesn't quite
I'll be
map
honest
to
with
your
you.
understanding of this stuff?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I don't know what that means. Like, I know
Okay.
what you mean.
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
exactly what you mean because I hear people saying that. I'm not sure how to measure that necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
You know me, I always bring it back to the threat bucket,
Yeah.
because to me it's easier to understand things from looking at it based on stress.
Mm-hmm.
Stress and threat. So, can you tax your CNS so that your performance is downgraded in the moment? Maybe your motor control is not as good, maybe your balance is not as good. Sure, I understand that if that's how people are approaching it. I just kind of look at that as threat-based responses that are kind of causing that down, or that decrease in performance, or possibly an increase in pain.
And maybe to make it even more specific, I think a lot of times it's spoken about in the context of deadlifts or squats, or basically when you're loading the spine.
Right.
And so would it be fair to say that the spine is really important? And so if you're really loading it a lot, you're going to feel a much higher proportion of threat than maybe if you were just doing like an isolated
Yeah.
calf
This
raise type thing.
totally. I mean, the spine is super important, and it is a higher order system. I mean, it is a super highway of sensory information going to and from the brain. So it's a high order system. And yeah, if you put enough load on your spine that it's starting to cause issues, yeah, that is going to manifest into something, no doubt, for
Mm-hmm.
sure. And that's because it's the midline of the body. It's
Mm-hmm.
super important. Your brain really prioritizes the midline structures. So for sure.
Cool. Yeah, I was just curious about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, so hopefully I was able to kind of paint this picture on like we tend to gravitate towards these activities that we really need. And we have to approach that mindfully, because if we're not careful and we're constantly seeking out that stimulus, we can potentially overdose. Now, because I've been talking so much about interoception, this is an important thing to mention. Interoception is really interesting because it's one of the areas of the brain that we see more imbalance that's very obvious versus some of the other areas of the cortex. So what I mean by that is you can have heightened internal awareness of your body. So you can have, like any sense, we can develop it, right? Meaning maybe you know somebody that has great body awareness and they kind of are always able to, understand, okay, what hurts in my body. And they're able to understand all these little things. They seem to have this really great body awareness. And sometimes you listen to these people and you're like, you really can sense that? Like I don't really necessarily feel like I can sense those things.
Hmm.
And that's somebody with a really heightened sense of interoception. And that takes time, and that's a skill to develop. And we often see that athletes develop really good interoception because they're always asking themselves the question, how do I feel?
Mm-hmm.
If you constantly ask yourself, how do I feel? You're constantly building your interoceptive map. And guess what? A lot of people don't do. They don't ask themselves, how do they feel? They just go. And
Yeah.
we often see that there can be a big discrepancy in a person's interoceptive awareness. And we see people who happen to, it seems like they don't have a good interoceptive map. It can kind of work both ways. You can be too interoceptive. You can be the person that has such a heightened level of interoception that they are distracted by their own heartbeat,
Mm-hmm.
which is, if anyone's ever experienced that, that's very annoying.
Yeah.
Right? Imagine that, right? Or you are distracted by your own breathing.
That's happened to me before.
It has, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you can experience that, like if you have feelings of anxiety and your breathing is changing because of the anxiety and your rate of respiration is increasing, that can get to a point where it's kind of distracting you, because as you're focusing on it, your interoceptive sense is becoming more and more heightened. And guess what? That is only good to a certain point. So it's like we want to have this really clear interoceptive sense that allows us to understand, when are we hungry? When are we full? Right? What is this emotion that I'm feeling? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Happiness, being sad, right? We need maps for all this stuff. And that's what interoception helps us with. But if we have too much of it, now it's becoming a negative thing. And I have had many clients in the past who have had interoception that is too strong. And it's actually difficult to work with them. Guess why? Everything you do as a coach in the movement world requires you to ask your client, how do you feel? And do you
Right.
feel the muscle?
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, when you go down, I want you to breathe like this. And when you go up, I want you to breathe like that. And so when somebody has heightened interoception and you're trying to exercise and you're giving them all these interoceptive cues that we often do, which brings our attention inward, not outward. And there's a big difference between the two with exercise. Let me tell you, it's huge. You are now potentially creating an exercise environment for that person that they're not going to like. And different history findings can bring a person to this. Again, I don't want to go too far into it right now, but we will definitely circle back to it at some point.
Yeah.
One of the things that comes to mind is like history of different issues with breathing, or like if people have had like multiple abdominal surgeries or some sort of insult to the midline of the body, it can cause these kind of interoceptive or imbalances in the insula. And where I was going with this kind of leads us back to those two examples of yoga and bodybuilding, where we often see that based on the problem that we have, we get attracted to a certain activity because of what it can do. But if we happen to be the person that's like too interoceptively dominant, there can be a dosage to it. Or it can kind of like always, you can kind of get to a point where it's giving you what you want, you feel good, and then you feel really bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that often happens with people in yoga and in bodybuilding. And with bodybuilding, you get a lot of people who tell stories about struggling with like a body dysmorphia.
Yeah.
That is a insular thing. That's an insular thing, which is interesting. So a lot of bodybuilders kind of get attracted to bodybuilding for needing a lot of insular activation, but it also can kind of work against them because it drives more of the potential problem. So it's interesting when you start kind of looking at, especially these two, because of the interoceptive quality, how two polar opposites, yoga and bodybuilding, can actually be great tools for training the insula. And of course, you just always want to make sure that you're doing that in a way that you're getting the right dosage and feeling good with what you're doing.
Yeah, and that's a good lesson in life in general, right?
Yeah.
And on the personal level, especially, it reminds me kind of what we were talking about earlier when you were saying, all these fitness disciplines and modalities kind of feel like they're constantly at war. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, this is superior for X, Y, and Z, so therefore it's
Right.
better. And it's like, well, it seems a little cyclical as well. It's like when the fad is, let's all focus on this one aspect of fitness, then the next thing that comes around is the thing that's going to balance that out and fix the problems that come with hyper focusing on, you know,
Oh, that's
uh,
such a good point. That's such a good
bodybuilding,
point.
or hyper focusing on flexibility, or yeah.
Yeah. And you know what? One of my observations too, to kind of go with that, is one of the things I've seen over the years diving into different forms of fitness or different, methodologies for pain and rehab, is that usually the innovator of the system is somebody that needed that stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
And so
It,
you get a lot of like bias in that way. Like people who, innovators of these systems that teach you all about breathing. Well, they happen to be somebody that grew up with asthma, had a history of, breathing dysfunction, and they built a system around breathing that worked for them. And that's kind of, their tangent, if you will, because they needed that stimulus. And you see that in all different forms of movement too. It's really, really interesting. And it's not good or bad. It just is. And I think it always just comes back to whatever you're choosing to do. You want to explore different things so that you can be more well-rounded, and you want to try to find balance in whatever it is that you're doing. And we get into trouble when we get so devoted to one method of fitness, and
yeah,
and or over devoted to one certain kind of therapeutic intervention, right?
yeah.
Because we've got a nervous system, we've got a brain, we need so many different kinds of stimulus, and we have to go out and find ways to get that. So I love thinking about it like that.
This happens with diets all the time, and
Oh
I've
gosh,
probably been
yes.
guilty of this. But it's like, when you like try something new and you're like, man, it's been 2 weeks, I feel fantastic,
Yep.
and then you tell everybody like, this, you gotta try this, guys, like you gotta
Yep.
do this. Yeah, it's
Oh
it's
my
like
gosh,
clockwork.
it is. It's exactly. Um, so I'm just looking at my list here. Do you want to quickly? I'll try. You want to like kind of talk about more therapeutic interventions?
Yeah, I mean, the one that based on where we are in this conversation, when you were talking about too much of a good thing, a couple episodes ago, we were talking about the Theragun,
Oh yeah.
and I was using it around an injury in my knee. And at first I felt like it really helped, and it like just kind of unlocked some extra range of motion and was feeling good.
Mm-hmm.
And then it kind of just flipped on me. And
Mm.
suddenly it was like tightening it up more, and it was kind of painful. And you were like, yeah, man, like, you didn't say it in this tone, but you were like, yeah, like, something that's good for you for 2 minutes might not be good for you for 30 minutes. And like, you're
Yeah.
probably overdoing it. And I was like, yep.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the dosage is always hard. That's kind of the part of the craft with any applied stimulus is figuring out what the dosage should be.
Hmm.
And that's challenging. I always actually feel bad about that part when I'm helping people because I don't really know what the dosage is all the time. And so I try to start people off, with what I would guess is maybe their minimal effective.
Hmm.
And you kind of build from there. And it's tough because I want to be able to like paint the clearest picture in terms of the process for the person, and I can't always do that. So you have to really explore it. And sometimes if it flips on you, like you said, that is an indicator that maybe the dosage is not right. Interestingly, I just thought of this. I wanted to share it with you. I told a story a couple episodes back on our member that's also in our neuro dojo who fixed their muscle imbalance with sound stimulus.
Yeah.
She
Yeah.
was working on a right glute muscle imbalance. Basically, nothing would help her with the strength part. She never felt her glutes very well, tried different things, nothing seemed to work. We ended up using what's called cranial nerve activations, which for her was sound stimulus in her right ear, and that helped facilitate greater glute function. And she did this for 8 weeks, about 3 times a week. She included the sound stimulus in her right ear while she was strength training and while she was going for walks. She was just listening to her favorite music, but only in the right ear. And after 8 weeks, the results stuck. And now she's like, she has all these great things to say about, she's like, I'm feeling my body totally differently. Like when I go for a walk, like my glute actually works when I'm strength training. She talked about her back squat has become better. She's able to
Hmm.
move more weight. It's really cool. Well, yesterday I heard from another one of our members who's taken the Neuro Dojo, and she was complaining of a click that she was having in her left shoulder with overhead pressing. And what she said was every time she does some of the overhead pressing exercises in the strength dojo, which is our strength training workout, she's able to do like a certain amount of reps. And then what happens is she gets this click, and the click sets her back. It kind of creates weakness in her shoulder
Hmm.
and some discomfort. And then she can't really increase the weights, and she feels like she can't do any more. She stops. So, kind of a long story short, we'd run some assessments. I teach people how to assess themselves in the Neuro Dojo. And what we learned about her is she has what we call a left PMRF pattern, which, without going crazy into the weeds, what that means is that her left brainstem is not doing its job well. And when it's not doing its job well, it means that muscle tone can be somewhat imbalanced on the left side of her body, and she can lack good reflexive stabilization, meaning the type of stability that we don't have to think about. It's just
Hmm.
there. When you pick
Hmm.
up a weight, you don't have to say, okay, abdominals, I want you to make sure that you contract too, so that when I pick up this weight, we don't fall over.
Hmm.
That's called reflexive stabilization. So she was having this problem with left-sided overhead pressing with the clicking. So we talked in our community, and it was cool because we had multiple people kind of chiming in too. And we said, okay, let's start exploring some cranial nerves. So being the resourceful person that she is, and she's not a movement professional. Well, she kind of is in the sense that she teaches martial arts, but she's not like a personal trainer. But she has an understanding of, the body. She decided to use cranial nerves, and she combined two activations. She put sound in her left ear, and she took this, what she called a chew. This is like, it almost looked like a little glue stick. She said she got dental work done a couple years ago, and the dentist gave her what was called a chew. It was basically, looks like plastic that you can bite on,
Hmm.
almost like rubber or silicone. She put that between her molars on the left side, and she chewed it while she was working out, like biting it, so that she was
Yeah.
using more of her jaw muscles on the left side, which happened to be related to the left brainstem because the trigeminal nerve inserts into
Mm-hmm.
the brainstem. And when you play sound in your ear on the left side, that activates cranial nerve 8, which also inserts into the brainstem. Both of these particular activations go to an area called the pons, which helps us with activation or facilitation of extensor muscles. Those are the muscles that hold us upright against gravity. Or if you're pulling, like doing a pull up or something like that, or a deadlift, you're working on your extensor muscles, your posterior chain.
Mm-hmm.
Well, by activating those two cranial nerves with the sound and the chewing, the click went away instantly, and she was able to perform the pressing movements. She was assessing and reassessing as she went. She did a pre-test without it. She had the click and it was uncomfortable. She chewed the piece of silicone, put the sound in her left ear, click's gone, and now she can press. So she messages back into this thread that we have going, and she's like, what the heck? She's like, it's not that I didn't believe that this could happen, but this was her first like experience where she took the information, applied it on her own,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden her limitation was gone.
Yeah.
She started,
Instantly. Like,
yeah, instantly. And she started asking all the right questions. Okay, how long do I have to do this? How can we make this stick? And I was like, listen, you're asking all the right questions. It's also going to come down to dosage. Is this activation strong enough to see long-term results? Obviously, we have to put the work in now because you're going to use this activation during the training to help you reduce threat and rebalance muscle tone so that you can achieve better pressing. So we don't know the answers yet, right? Now she's got to put this into practice, and we're going to see what happens. And now that we have those clues, I think she's going to be able to put this together in a way to help her. And hopefully, just like our other member, she did this work for about 8 weeks and it stuck. So we'll see what happens. But another cool one, and
yeah.
just really like just fun for me to hear about as the coach because it's complicated information. It's hard for people at first, you know. We really simplify it in a really great applicable way, but it's still a lot. And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
always asking myself, like, are people equipped? Like, can they use it? And so when you hear about stories like that, it's like, nice, high five.
Yeah. I mean, you definitely need an understanding of some of these mechanisms, like knowing that, that nerve inserts in the left stem,
Yep.
and that could be the issue, and therefore stimulating the cranial nerve on the left side. Like, that's not something anybody is just going to intuit ever.
No,
Yeah.
it's wild. And I think about instances like this too, because this has been a chronic shoulder thing for her for a while. And this is why people can get so lost when they try to resolve issues and they go and seek out help. Because if she had just gone to her doctor, it's like, who knows what would have happened, right?
Yeah.
The answer could have been like, well, we can give you an injection, right? Or, you can go do 12 weeks of PT and maybe that will help. Or, if you keep coming back to me and, we see you 3 times, well, now are you all of a sudden a candidate for some kind of intervention like a surgery that you're being told you need?
Mm.
In my mind, it's just pain. And
Mm-hmm.
pain can be manipulated in so many different ways. So that's why you have to be careful that you don't go down a rabbit hole too soon. And I'm never one to say, don't go get other people's opinions because you need to do that sometimes. But I always think about what a rabbit hole people get sent down when they show up to their doctor and they have clicking in their shoulder. And now you're being told that there's some kind of damage and what that does to you psychologically when so far all this person had to do was bite something on the left and listen to some music. And it's like,
Yeah.
man, I really hope I can get more of this information out there
Yeah.
because it's when you hear it like that and you think about it like that, it's so simple. It just takes some time to get comfortable with, and you need to understand some of the neurology to really buy into that process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Totally. Totally. Well, hopefully, if you're listening at home and you're learning this stuff and you're assessing and you're testing and reassessing, and it's working for you, share the podcast, right?
Do
Let
it.
people know
Yeah,
about us.
absolutely. And for movement practitioners who are out there, I mean, I will tell you that this type of information is game changing for a movement professional. And if you're a movement professional and you're looking to increase your tool set, then you definitely got to lean into some of this content, and then hopefully eventually get to the point where you're ready to take our Neuro Dojo class, because it's unbelievable. And you will literally learn how to assess the things that I just talked about and how to apply them to your clients. And keep in mind, I have people that of the general population who are doing it. Both stories that I have told the last couple of weeks are people who aren't personal trainers. They're not physical therapists, and they're doing applied neurology at a level that is not even, it doesn't even exist in this world. It's crazy. But it's so cool. It's so cool.
Nice.
All right, there it is. Thank you so much, Tony, and thank you to our listeners. If you want to be a ninja and you want to be a pain-free ninja, then definitely check out our Strength and Mobility Dojo and come along for the ride. I promise you'll learn a tool set that will help you keep training pain-free for years to come. Thanks again.